Pranks have long drawn the mischievous, the bored, the attention-seeking. But beneath the laughter lies a darker truth, one where harmless fun transforms into unthinkable tragedy. These are the most terrifying tragedies caused by pranks, each one a reminder that sometimes the line between entertainment and horror is thinner than we ever imagined. It was May 24, 2021. The desert heat in Tempe, Arizona had reached 96 degrees by late afternoon. Inside an off-campus apartment, fluorescent lights hummed over a small kitchen with laminate floors still warm from the day's heat. Dashiell Reese had just completed his daily ritual. At 20 years old, the computer science major stood 6 feet tall with the lean build of someone who never missed his 4-mile runs. Sweat still clung to his shirt as he entered the apartment, unaware that his roommates had spent the afternoon preparing what they believed would be harmless entertainment. The 2 business students had been planning their next social media video. Text messages recovered later would reveal their intention to test whether Dashiell was exaggerating about his peanut allergy. They had prepared a protein smoothie, secretly adding peanut powder. To them, it was just another prank for their followers. Dashiell approached the kitchen counter where his roommates had positioned their phone camera. When he asked about ingredients, citing his known peanut allergy, his roommates looked him directly in the eye and assured him it was completely safe. No peanuts, no allergens. They promised he could trust them. This was the moment that sealed his fate. Not the peanut powder itself, but the deliberate lie that convinced him to ignore his survival instincts. Believing their false assurances, Dashiell lifted the glass. The camera captured everything as he consumed approximately 4 ounces in 2 confident gulps. His roommates watched, expecting minor sniffling for comedic effect. They had no understanding of what they had just set in motion. The reaction began within minutes: oral tingling, throat irritation. His roommates initially laughed, still believing their prank was proceeding as planned. But Dashiell's body was already fighting a battle it could not win. Hives erupted across his neck. His breathing became labored, each wheeze audible on the recording. The realization struck all 3 of them simultaneously. This was not the minor reaction they had anticipated. Panic consumed the apartment. One roommate frantically searched for Dashiell's EpiPen, while the other dialed 911. When they found the auto-injector, it had expired 18 months earlier. They used it, but the degraded medication provided only limited effect against the rapidly progressing reaction. Emergency responders arrived to find a young man in severe respiratory distress. Paramedics first administered intramuscular epinephrine, the standard first-line treatment. But his airway was already rapidly closing. Only after his condition deteriorated further did they attempt to secure an advanced airway. Eventually placing one despite the swelling, and began an epinephrine infusion during transport. But the damage was irreversible. At 6:02 p.m., less than 1 hour after trusting his roommate's promise of safety, Dashiell Reese was pronounced dead. The medical examiner's report was unambiguous: anaphylactic shock caused by peanut exposure. Laboratory analysis confirmed peanut protein in both the blender residue and Dashiell's stomach contents. The recording later became key evidence. Investigators used the footage and recovered messages to show the roommates knowingly introduced an allergen, despite his warnings. Prosecutors filed reckless homicide charges, citing their disregard for a known medical risk. Dashiell Reese ultimately died because he relied on assurances that were false. It was January 12, 2022. Minneapolis had become a frozen wasteland where breath turned to ice and metal burned skin on contact. The city's underground parking garages offered refuge from the brutal cold. But sometimes, refuge becomes a tomb. Peter Shaw never saw it coming. The 35-year-old marketing analyst had built his life on routine and predictability. His co-workers found his reliability both admirable and boring, which made him the perfect target for what they thought would be harmless fun. He parked in the same space every day, arrived at the same time, and rarely deviated from his schedule. Outside of work, his habits were equally structured: weekly grocery runs, early morning workouts, and evenings spent maintaining his SUV, which he took pride in keeping spotless. The plan was simple: plant a jump scare in Peter's SUV, use his spare key fob to remote start the engine so the cabin would be warm, and record his reaction. They believed it would be harmless. The garage where Peter parked was an architectural relic. Concrete walls, low ceiling. The garage's aging, poorly ventilated layout allowed exhaust gases to accumulate far faster than modern standards would permit. When Peter's colleague pressed the remote start button from the street above, the SUV's engine started running in the enclosed lower level of the garage. Exhaust flowed from the tailpipe and began moving through the stagnant air of the garage. Peter walked into the garage and approached his SUV, finding it already warmed from the remote start. When he opened the door, the motion-triggered mask activated as intended, causing him to react with brief surprise. The prank had worked as his co-workers expected. But Peter didn't leave. He had gear to organize, equipment to check. With the engine running in the confined space, carbon monoxide began concentrating inside the SUV's cabin and the surrounding garage. As carbon monoxide levels rose, the SUV's interior air gradually shifted toward a dangerous concentration. The text he sent his co-workers was cheerful, acknowledging their successful prank. Those would be his last words to anyone. As carbon monoxide saturated his bloodstream, Peter's responses slowed and his movements became uncoordinated, consistent with the effects of progressing hypoxia. Remote start systems typically shut off after 15 minutes, but when Peter sat in the driver's seat and turned the key to accessory mode, the run timer was effectively extended. The engine continued its deadly work, while Peter slipped into unconsciousness. Security footage later showed Peter becoming disoriented and eventually losing consciousness as carbon monoxide levels rose. He never regained awareness. A resident reported a strong exhaust odor in the hallway, prompting maintenance to investigate. As they opened the garage access door, building carbon monoxide alarms activated, confirming the source. They found Peter slumped over in a vehicle that had become his coffin. The medical examiner determined that his blood contained 58% carbon monoxide, more than double the lethal threshold. The investigation was swift. Security cameras had recorded everything. Key fob logs provided timestamps. Carbon monoxide detectors offered scientific proof of the invisible killer. His co-workers faced the devastating realization that their harmless prank had become involuntary manslaughter. They had wanted to give Peter a moment of surprise. Instead, they had given him death. Investigators concluded the death resulted from prolonged carbon monoxide exposure after the prank unintentionally kept the engine running. His co-workers were later charged with involuntary manslaughter due to the foreseeable risk their actions created. It was late morning on July 22, 2021. Lake Tahoe's eastern shore sparkled under a cloudless Nevada sky, the crystal-clear water reflecting the sun. At 73 degrees with barely a whisper of wind, it was the kind of summer day that draws people to the mountains. The lake remained noticeably cooler than the air, typical for Tahoe, and the temperature drop reduced his breath-holding capacity once he submerged. Lachlan Cole had always been drawn to water. The 22-year-old freelance photographer possessed restless energy, always chasing the next adventure or perfect shot. Friends later told investigators he often volunteered for stunts without hesitation, a habit that shaped many of his projects. That morning, Lachlan arrived with his girlfriend Sarah and roommate Jake, both fellow creatives. Jake had brought his underwater action camera, eager to capture content for social media. The wooden dock stretched 30 feet into water that dropped to 15 feet deep, creating the perfect stage for their planned video. The idea seemed brilliant. Lachlan would stage a drowning prank while Jake filmed from below the surface, capturing the rescue from underwater. Sarah would play the panicked girlfriend on the dock before they revealed the joke. What none of them knew was that beneath the pristine surface, invisible dangers lurked. Old fishing lines and weights, discarded by careless anglers over the years, created a deadly web in the deeper waters near the dock. The performance began exactly as planned. Lachlan swam 25 feet from the dock and began his theatrical struggle. His acting was convincing, thrashing and calling for help while Sarah screamed from the platform. Jake positioned himself about 8 feet below the surface, with several more feet of deeper water still beneath him. After 30 seconds of fake distress, Lachlan took a deep breath and Submerged as rehearsed. Jake filmed from below, expecting his friend to surface within 15 seconds with a triumphant grin. But something had gone terribly wrong. Instead of controlled descent, Lachlan's movements became erratic and desperate. His leg had become entangled in submerged fishing line attached to an old anchor weight, invisible until it was too late. What had started as a performance became genuine panic as the line cinched tightly around his ankle, preventing him from rising. Jake's underwater footage would later reveal the critical moment when entertainment became tragedy. Lachlan's attempts to surface grew increasingly frantic as the fishing line prevented his escape. His lungs, already strained from fake struggling, began demanding air his body couldn't reach. Jake, running low on air himself, was forced to surface to breathe, losing precious seconds while his friend fought for his life below. When he dove back down, Lachlan's movements had become weak and uncoordinated, the fight slowly leaving his body. Desperation drove Jake to dive repeatedly, finally grabbing a small utility knife from the dock to cut through the fishing line. But 2 minutes and 40 seconds underwater had already done irreversible damage to his friend's oxygen-starved brain. Sarah called 911 while Jake performed CPR, focusing on chest compressions as recommended for drowning victims. Paramedics arrived about 18 minutes later, a typical response time for that part of the lake. But their advanced life support couldn't undo what the lake had already taken. The coroner's determination was straightforward: death by drowning, with fishing line entanglement preventing the victim's ability to surface. Jake's underwater footage provided investigators with a complete sequence of events. Lachlan Cole had drowned not in a genuine accident, but in a staged scenario that turned fatal once the underwater entanglement prevented him from surfacing. It was March 8, 2022. The Texas night stretched across State Route 287, a long corridor of asphalt cutting through miles of open ranch land. At 52 degrees under a new moon, the landscape beyond the highway was pitch black, with only passing headlights breaking the darkness. Cora Hayes was driving home from another 12-hour shift at the county hospital's emergency department. The 26-year-old nurse was known for staying calm under pressure and for taking isolated back roads without hesitation. Her route home always included a brief stop at a small rest area where cell service returned. The rest area was one of the newer facilities along the highway, equipped with standard surveillance cameras and designated parking sections for cars and commercial trucks. Across the lot, Tyler Brooks, 28, and his friend Danny, 25, were preparing a prank they believed would startle Cora and end quickly with recognition and laughter. Their plan was simple. Danny would approach wearing a mask as a quick scare, while Tyler recorded from a distance. They expected her to realize who it was once she saw the truck and both men together. They positioned themselves behind a line of mesquite trees, assuming traffic in that stretch would remain sparse at that hour. When Cora pulled into the rest area and stepped out under the lone streetlight, she checked her phone as usual. Danny moved toward her as rehearsed, wearing the ski mask and approaching rapidly. But instead of freezing or hesitating, Cora reacted with the instincts of someone trained to avoid isolated threats. She immediately ran toward the highway, moving toward visibility and potential help rather than retreating toward the dark rest area. Danny continued after her, still believing she would recognize the prank once Tyler stepped out with the camera. Tyler remained 50 yards away, recording the unfolding scene while unaware that the reaction had escalated beyond anything they anticipated. Cora reached the edge of the highway just as an 18-wheeler approached, its headlights illuminating the road ahead at 70 miles per hour. The truck driver had less than 2 seconds from the moment she entered his headlight beam to register her presence. An 80,000-pound commercial truck traveling at that speed requires several hundred feet to stop. But the driver had far less than that. He engaged the air brakes immediately. Yet the distance was insufficient to avoid impact. The collision occurred at the outer edge of the right lane. The driver pulled his vehicle to a stop and called 911. Highway patrol and EMS units responded. They located Cora approximately 40 feet from the initial point of impact, consistent with a high-speed collision on an unlit highway. Tyler's still recording phone documented the events leading up to the impact. Investigators reviewed the footage, confirming that Cora believed she was fleeing an actual threat, not a prank. Danny's pursuit toward the highway was captured clearly, establishing how the chase placed her directly into the path of oncoming traffic. The truck driver was quickly cleared of wrongdoing. Both Tyler and Danny were charged with involuntary manslaughter for initiating a staged scare in a location where escape routes led directly to an active highway. Their planning, footage, and positions at the scene provided investigators with a complete timeline of the incident. The coroner determined that Cora Hayes died instantly from blunt force trauma, the outcome of a prank that unintentionally placed her in the path of a moving truck. It was September 2nd, 2022. The humid Wisconsin night pressed against the residence hall at a university in Madison, the still air settling thickly in the upper floors. At 72 degrees with minimal circulation, the building's older HVAC system had shifted into its low-power night mode, reducing airflow through the narrow corridors. Tobin Wells, a 20-year-old computer science major, returned from the campus library with the quiet routine he followed every night. He was known for being focused, reserved, and predictable, rarely mentioning his long-standing asthma. Few knew that the inhaler in his desk drawer was nearly empty, something he had postponed replacing during a busy week. Down the hall, his suite mates, 3 business majors, had planned what they believed would be a harmless scare. They had grown bored with typical dorm pranks and decided to escalate the stunt by using a ski mask and a small keychain-sized canister of pepper spray to make the scares seem more dramatic. Their online searches had shown temporary irritation as the usual outcome, and none had considered how aerosolized capsaicin behaves in enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces. The building's design made conditions worse. Constructed in the 1970s, the dorm relied on sealed fire doors and long, narrow hallways that limited natural ventilation after hours. The low-power HVAC mode allowed airborne irritants to remain suspended much longer than the pranksters realized. As Tobin walked toward the suite, one of the students positioned himself in the doorway, wearing the ski mask, waiting to jump forward on cue. Another crouched beside him with the pepper spray, planning to discharge a short burst toward the floor for dramatic effect. When Tobin rounded the corner, the masked figure lunged forward. Startled, he dropped his notebook. The second student triggered a half-second burst of pepper spray, intending only to startle him. Instead, the aerosol dispersed rapidly, forming a lingering cloud that filled the stagnant corridor. Tobin began coughing almost immediately, his airways constricting in response to the airborne capsaicin. Within seconds, he was wheezing, bent over, and unable to draw a full breath. The suite mates, realizing the prank had escalated beyond anything they intended, moved him into the lounge and opened a window, but the limited airflow did little to clear the irritant. One student ran to retrieve Tobin's inhaler, only to discover the canister was nearly empty. The brief, partial dose it delivered offered no relief. His breathing deteriorated quickly, his chest rising and falling with visible effort as he tried to compensate for the narrowing of his airways. By the time 911 was called, Tobin was using all accessory muscles to breathe, his lips turning pale. Paramedics arrived and administered nebulized bronchodilators and oxygen, but the prolonged airway spasm had already driven him into respiratory failure, which progressed to cardiac arrest during transport. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. The medical examiner determined that Tobin Wells died from status asthmaticus, precipitated by capsaicin exposure in a confined hallway with limited ventilation. Residue testing confirmed the pepper spray particles along the corridor. The students involved were later charged with reckless endangerment, resulting in death. It was October 29th, 2021. The autumn rain pushed against the windows of a downtown Albany restaurant, the steady drizzle cooling the air to 51 degrees. Halloween weekend had arrived with gray skies and damp streets, making indoor gatherings far more appealing than anything outside. Genevieve Miller, a 24-year-old assistant manager, was finishing the last tasks of the night. Known for her organization and reliability, she often stayed late to complete inventory before the morning crew arrived. The restaurant's basement storage area, built decades earlier, held linens and cleaning supplies in a series of low-ceilinged rooms with limited airflow. A small restroom sat off the main hallway, equipped with an aging exhaust vent that moved very little air after hours. Upstairs, several members of the kitchen staff had prepared a Halloween-themed scare. One line cook had purchased several pounds of dry ice to create fog effects and decided to use the basement restroom for a prank. The plan involved placing a bucket of warm water and dry ice inside the small room, letting the fog roll out when Genevieve opened the door. They reviewed it briefly, believing the effect would be harmless. The restroom measured roughly 45 square feet, and with the exhaust fan barely functioning at night, airflow was minimal. As the dry ice sublimated, it produced visible white vapor mixed with heavier carbon dioxide gas, while the fog itself was only condensed water vapor. The CO2 accumulating beneath it displaced oxygen in the lower portion of the room. Over several minutes, concentrations increased to levels capable of causing dizziness and loss of consciousness in a confined space. As Genevieve finished her rounds and walked downstairs, one co-worker positioned himself in the hallway with his phone ready to record the reveal. The bucket in the restroom had been producing vapor for nearly 10 minutes. Fog pooled near the floor and seeped under the door. Genevieve opened the restroom door, clipboard in hand. To her, the effect looked like a harmless decorative setup. She stepped inside and bent down to move the bucket so she could access the shelving behind it. At that lower height, she entered the area with the highest CO2 concentration. Her first breaths contained significantly reduced oxygen. Within seconds, she became lightheaded. Her breathing quickened, and she lost consciousness shortly afterward. Collapsing onto the floor, the co-worker filming hesitated at first, assuming she was reacting to the prank. When she remained motionless, he approached the doorway and immediately felt mild dizziness himself. Recognizing the risk, he propped the door fully open and dragged the bucket into the hallway to allow fresh air to enter. He then found Genevieve on the floor, unresponsive but still breathing. Emergency responders arrived to find elevated CO2 levels inside the restroom. Paramedics administered high-flow oxygen and ventilation support. Genevieve briefly regained a pulse, but the prolonged oxygen deprivation had caused severe hypoxic brain injury. She was transported to Albany Medical Center and placed on life support. Despite medical intervention, Genevieve Miller died hours later. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be hypoxic brain injury, resulting from carbon dioxide accumulation in a confined, poorly ventilated space. Investigators concluded that the dry ice placed in the restroom created a hazardous atmosphere that Genevieve unknowingly entered during her routine duties. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now